The morning arrived draped in gold, as though nature herself conspired to mock the trembling heart of Lady Rosalind Ashworth. Through the tall windows of her chambers at Ashworth Manor, sunlight spilled across Persian carpets and caught in the crystal vases overflowing with orange blossoms, their heavy, sweet perfume saturating the air until she could scarcely breathe without tasting wedding on her tongue. Her maid, Martha, moved about the room with practiced efficiency, laying out silk stockings and pearl-buttoned gloves, while her mother's seamstress made final adjustments to the ivory gown that hung like a ghost against the mahogany wardrobe. Rosalind sat motionless at her vanity, watching her own reflection as though observing a stranger, her chestnut hair being arranged into an elaborate coiffure threaded with seed pearls and white roses. She looked, she thought distantly, exactly as a bride should look, porcelain skin, lips touched with just enough color to suggest health rather than artifice, eyes wide and clear. Yet beneath the composure, beneath the careful arrangement of silk and sentiment, her heart beat an erratic rhythm that had nothing to do with joy. She was to marry Duke Edmund Blackwood in 3 hours' time, a man she had met precisely 7 times during their courtship, each encounter orchestrated by their families with the precision of a military campaign. He was handsome, certainly dark-haired and tall, with the kind of aristocratic features that looked as though they had been carved from marble by an artist who favored sharp angles and brooding intensity. But he was also cold, his conversation polite yet distant, his smiles rare and seemingly rationed like wartime provisions. Her mother called him distinguished, her father called him an excellent match. Rosalind called him, privately, in the silence of her own thoughts, utterly unknowable. She had told herself, during sleepless nights when doubt crept through her resolve like winter through cracked windows, that love might come later. That warmth could grow between 2 people bound by vows and shared purpose. That perhaps his coldness was merely reserve, and beneath it lay depths she had not yet been permitted to explore. The thought offered small comfort now as she watched Martha's hands work through her hair, each pin securing her more firmly to a future she could not quite envision. Outside, she could hear the sounds of preparation, horses being readied, carriages arriving, the distant murmur of servants ensuring every detail met the exacting standards befitting the union of 2 prominent families. The day was perfect, absolutely perfect, each element arranged to create a memory of beauty and grace. Yet Rosalind felt as though she was standing at the edge of a great precipice, about to step forward into empty air, sustained only by the hope that someone had built a bridge she simply could not yet see. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. The Church of St. Catherine stood resplendent in the June sunshine, its ancient stones warm beneath cascades of ivy and climbing roses, its doors thrown open to receive the procession of society's finest families, who arrived in carriages polished to mirror brightness, the ladies in their summer silks and the gentlemen in their formal attire, all gathered to witness the union that would bind the Ashworth and Blackwood estates in matrimony. Rosalind arrived precisely on time, her hand trembling only slightly on her father's arm as they waited in the vestibule. The organ swelling with Bach's prelude as the appointed hour approached, and she could see through the doorway the pews filled with familiar faces, the altar dressed in white lilies and roses, the vicar standing ready with his prayer book open, everything perfect, everything as it should be, except for the one absence that began as a whisper of concern and grew, with each passing minute, into something closer to alarm. Edmund was late. At first, it seemed a trifle, 10 minutes, perhaps a delay with his carriage or some minor crisis of dress, but as 10 minutes became 20, became 30, the whispers in the church shifted from polite murmuring to barely concealed speculation, and Rosalind felt her father's arm tense beneath her hand, felt her mother's anxious glance from where she sat in the front pew, her fan moving rapidly despite the pleasant temperature. Rosalind stood frozen in her ivory gown, the heavy silk suddenly oppressive, the pearl-encrusted bodice feeling like armor that could not possibly protect her from whatever was unfolding, and she maintained her composure through sheer force of will, her face a practiced mask of serenity, even as something cold and terrible began to unfurl in her chest. It was nearly an hour past the appointed time when the doors opened again, not to admit the Duke, but rather his private secretary, Mr. Thornfield, a thin man with apologetic eyes who carried a sealed letter and approached the vicar with the kind of careful dignity one might employ when diffusing an explosive device. The church fell absolutely silent. Rosalind watched as the vicar broke the seal, read the contents, and his face underwent a transformation from confusion to shock to something that looked almost like pity. And when he looked up at the assembled guests, then at Rosalind herself, she knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to shatter into pieces she would never be able to properly reassemble. The vicar's voice, when he spoke, seemed to come from very far away, as though she were hearing it through water. "I regret to inform the assembled guests that His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, will not be joining us today. He has chosen to honor a prior commitment of marriage to Lady Constance Fairfax, daughter of the Earl of Pemberton." The words landed like physical blows. Chosen another, Lady Constance Fairfax, whose fortune was legendary, whose connections made even the Ashworths look provincial. The church erupted in shocked exclamations and hurried whispers, and Rosalind stood perfectly still at the altar, still holding her father's arm, still wearing her crown of orange blossoms, while 300 pairs of eyes turned to witness her humiliation, their gazes a mixture of pity, scandal-hungry curiosity, and barely concealed satisfaction that the proud Ashworth family had finally been brought low. And through it all, Rosalind did not cry, did not faint, did not give them the spectacle they perhaps expected, but simply stood there, a bride abandoned at the altar, her dreams of gradual love and eventual warmth turning to ash in her mouth as thoroughly as if she had tried to swallow fire. The carriage ride back to Ashworth Manor passed in a blur of summer hedgerows and pitying glances from the coachman, who had been instructed to take the back roads to spare the family further public exposure, and Rosalind sat in silence beside her mother, still wearing the ivory gown that had cost a small fortune and now felt like a burial shroud, the orange blossoms in her hair wilting in the heat until their perfume turned sickly sweet. And when they finally arrived at the manor, she walked through the familiar halls as though moving through a dream, or perhaps a nightmare from which she could not wake, past servants who averted their eyes and whispered in corners, past her father who stood in his study doorway looking older than she had ever seen him, his face grey with the particular shame of a man who cannot protect his daughter from the cruelties of the world, and up the grand staircase to her chambers, where Martha helped her out of the dress, with trembling hands and tears streaming down her cheeks. Though Rosalind herself remained dry-eyed, her grief too vast and terrible to be expressed through anything so simple as weeping. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of withdrawn curtains and untouched trays of food, and her mother came to sit beside her bed each morning, her hand cool against Rosalind's forehead as though checking for fever, her voice gentle with the kind of sympathy that somehow made everything worse, because it confirmed that yes, this terrible thing had happened. Yes, everyone knew. Yes, her life as she had imagined it was truly over, and Rosalind would listen to her mother's attempts at comfort assertions that Edmund Blackwood was clearly a scoundrel unworthy of her, that better matches would come, that time would heal all wounds, and she would nod and murmur agreement, while inside she conducted a different conversation entirely, one in which she asked herself the questions that had no comfortable answers. What was wrong with her that he had chosen another? What inadequacy had he seen that made her so easily discarded? Was she truly so worthless that she could be abandoned at the altar without even the courtesy of a personal explanation? And though her rational mind knew that his choice likely had nothing to do with her worth and everything to do with Lady Constance's superior fortune and connections, her heart, that treacherous, wounded thing, whispered that she had been weighed and found wanting, that she was somehow fundamentally unlovable, destined to be second choice or no choice at all. Society, naturally, revelled in the scandal, and the invitations that had once arrived daily ceased entirely, not because she was unwelcome precisely, but because no one quite knew how to treat a woman who had been so publicly rejected, and Rosalind found herself grateful for the isolation, retreating to the library in the evenings where she could lose herself in novels and poetry, in worlds where love conquered all and honor meant something more than financial calculation. And as the first week passed, she began to construct a new life for herself, smaller than the one she had envisioned as a duchess, quieter and more contained, a life of books and gardens and perhaps, eventually, a kind of peace that came from accepting that some dreams were simply not meant to be realized. And though her heart still ached with a pain so profound it sometimes made breathing difficult, she told herself that this too would pass, that she would survive this, as women had survived worse, that she would make of her life something meaningful, even if it bore no resemblance to the future she had imagined on that golden morning that now seemed a lifetime ago. 3 weeks had passed since that terrible morning at St. Catherine's Church, 3 weeks during which Rosalind had settled into her new, diminished existence, with the kind of resigned determination that comes when one realizes there is no alternative but to endure, and she had established a routine of sorts. Mornings spent in correspondence with the few friends who had not abandoned her entirely, afternoons in the conservatory tending to her mother's roses, evenings in the library, where she could lose herself in the worlds contained between leather bindings. And it was during one of these evenings, as she sat reading by lamplight in her chambers, that she first noticed the figure in the gardens below. It was past midnight, the house silent, save for the settling of old timbers and the distant hoot of an owl, and she had risen to close her curtains against the night chill when movement in the gardens caught her eye. A dark shape standing motionless beneath the ancient oak tree, whose branches nearly reached her window, and her first response was fear some intruder, perhaps, or a vagrant who had wandered onto the grounds. But as she watched from behind the safety of her curtain, barely breathing, the figure did nothing threatening, merely stood there in the moonlight, utterly still, facing toward the manor, toward her window specifically, in a vigil that seemed to have no purpose she could discern. She should have called for her father, should have alerted the servants that someone had breached the grounds, but something held her silent, some quality in the figure's stillness that spoke not of menace, but of something else entirely, something she could not quite name. And so she watched, her heart beating rapidly against her ribs, as the minutes stretched into an hour and still the figure did not move, did not approach the house or retreat into the darkness, but simply stood there as though waiting for something, or perhaps atoning for something, or perhaps merely bearing witness to her lighted window in the silent house. When she finally retired to bed near 2 in the morning, the figure was still there, and when she woke at dawn and rushed to the window, the gardens were empty, showing no sign that anyone had ever stood vigil beneath the oak, save for a slight depression in the grass, where someone had stood for hours without moving, and she told herself she had imagined it, that her grief-addled mind had conjured phantoms to populate her isolation. But the next night, as she prepared for bed, she could not resist checking the window, and there he was again, for she had begun to think of the figure as he standing in precisely the same spot, his posture one of absolute stillness. And this time she did not watch for merely minutes, but for hours, sitting in her window seat, with the lamp extinguished, so he could not see her observing him, and she felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity, and something else, something that felt dangerously like hope, or perhaps its shadow, stirring in her chest despite her best efforts to smother it. On the third night, Martha mentioned in passing while brushing out Rosalind's hair that the gardener had reported seeing a gentleman in the grounds after dark, a tall man in fine clothing who made no attempt to hide himself but who disappeared before anyone could approach him. And Rosalind felt her pulse quicken at this confirmation that she had not imagined the figure, that someone was indeed keeping this strange vigil beneath her window, for reasons she could not begin to fathom, and though she maintained her composure and told Martha it was likely just someone taking a shortcut through the grounds, inside her mind raced with questions she could not answer, and emotions she could not name, a terrible confused stirring of something that felt both like dread and anticipation, as though she stood on the edge of some precipice she could not see but could sense in the darkness ahead. The seventh night brought a moon so full and bright it turned the gardens silver, transforming every leaf and blade of grass into something almost ethereal, and Rosalind had positioned herself at the window earlier than usual. Driven by a compulsion she refused to examine too closely, when the figure appeared at his customary position beneath the oak tree, and this time, whether by design or by chance or by some cruel mercy of fate, the moonlight fell directly upon his face, illuminating features she had tried so desperately to forget, and the recognition hit her with the force of a physical blow. Edmund Blackwood, Duke of Pemberton, the man who had abandoned her at the altar, stood vigil beneath her window. The shock gave way almost immediately to rage, a fury so pure and terrible it left her trembling, her hands gripping the windowsill until her knuckles turned white. And she wanted to scream, to throw open the window and demand what right he had to come here, to stand on her family's grounds after what he had done, to haunt her nights with his presence when he had chosen another woman, married another woman, built a life with another woman, while she languished in shame and isolation. And the audacity of it, the sheer presumption that he could simply appear here without invitation or explanation, that his presence might be anything other than a fresh wound, upon wounds barely beginning to heal, made her want to descend to the gardens, not to speak with him, but to strike him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had inflicted upon her. Yet even as fury coursed through her veins like poison, another part of her mind worked with cold calculation, weighing her options with the kind of strategic thinking that grief and humiliation had taught her, and she realized that confronting him would give him exactly what he seemed to want: her acknowledgement, her attention, and her emotional engagement. And why should she grant him anything when he had granted her nothing but public humiliation and private anguish? And so she made a decision in that moment, standing at her window with moonlight streaming across her face and rage burning in her chest, that she would not confront him, would not speak to him, would not even acknowledge that she had seen him or knew of his presence, because to do so would be to admit that he still had power over her emotions, that he could still move her to action, that he mattered at all in the small, careful life she was building from the ruins he had left. From that night forward, a strange ritual established itself in the grounds of Ashworth Manor, a silent war conducted through presence and absence, acknowledgement and denial, for Edmund came every night without fail, arriving shortly after midnight and remaining until the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. Standing motionless in wind and weather, his face turned toward her lighted window, and Rosalind, for her part, maintained her position of absolute indifference, never opening her window to speak to him, never sending a servant to drive him away, never by word or gesture, or even the flicker of a curtain, indicating that she knew he was there, though in truth she was always aware of him, could feel his presence like a weight upon her consciousness, and could not sleep properly, knowing he stood vigil in the darkness below. She told herself her refusal to acknowledge him was a form of strength, a demonstration that he no longer held any claim upon her thoughts or feelings, but in the deep hours of night when sleep eluded her, and she sat by her window reading by lamplight, while he stood in the shadows below, she wondered if perhaps her silence was not strength at all but cowardice, a fear that if she spoke to him, if she looked directly at him, if she allowed herself to truly see him rather than the monster her hurt had created, she might discover feelings she was not prepared to face. And so the nights passed in this strange stalemate, neither of them yielding, neither of them breaking, two people locked in a dance of proximity and distance, presence and absence, while the world moved on around them and everyone else slept peacefully in their beds, unaware of the silent vigil being kept in the gardens of Ashworth Manor. The whispers began in drawing rooms across London, carried on the lips of servants who spoke to other servants, who spoke to their mistresses, who spoke in carefully modulated tones over tea and cards, and within a fortnight of Edmund's vigil beginning, society hummed with speculation about the Duke of Pemberton's peculiar nocturnal habits, for though he appeared at every necessary social function with his new Duchess on his arm, Constance Fairfax, now Constance Blackwood, resplendent in jewels that caught the candlelight and gowns that whispered of wealth beyond measure, his household staff could not help but notice that their master disappeared each night shortly before midnight and did not return until dawn. And while discretion was expected of good servants, the tale was simply too delicious to keep entirely silent. Lady Catherine Pemberton called on Rosalind in early November, ostensibly to deliver some books she thought might provide comfort, but Rosalind could see the curiosity burning behind her old friend's sympathetic expression, could hear the carefully casual quality in Catherine's voice when she mentioned that the Duke and Duchess had hosted a magnificent ball the previous week, that they seemed quite content together, that Constance wore her new status with grace, and Edmund performed his role as devoted husband with apparent conviction, and then, after a pause that felt calculated, Catherine added that nonetheless there were the strangest rumours about the Duke's whereabouts at night. Had Rosalind heard anything, living so close to his usual route, if he were indeed travelling somewhere, And Rosalind had smiled with a serenity she did not feel, and said she kept such early hours now that she could not possibly comment on the nocturnal wanderings of anyone, let alone a man who had made his indifference to her abundantly clear. Other visitors came with similar missions, thinly veiled as concerned Mrs. Hartwell, with her piercing eyes and talent for extracting confessions, young Amelia Bradshaw, who had always been more honest than tactful, and asked outright if it was true that the Duke came to Ashworth Manor under cover of darkness. Lord and Lady Sinclair, who spoke vaguely of seeing a figure matching Edmund's description in the village at odd hours, and to each Rosalind presented the same composed facade, neither confirming nor denying, neither expressing interest nor outrage, simply deflecting with the kind of dignified restraint that eventually convinced most of her visitors that she knew nothing of the Duke's activities and cared even less, though inside she burned with humiliation at being the subject of such speculation, at knowing that her private anguish had become public entertainment, that even her refusal to acknowledge Edmund's vigil could not prevent society from weaving narratives around their strange, silent connection. The most peculiar aspect of the gossip was the portrait it painted of Edmund's double life by day. He was everything a duke should be, attending Parliament, managing his estates, escorting his wife to the opera and the theatre, hosting dinners where he played the gracious host and she the accomplished hostess, and by all accounts they presented a picture of marital harmony that should have put to rest any speculation about the haste of their union. Yet by night he abandoned this performance entirely to stand in the gardens of the woman he had rejected, and Rosalind could not reconcile these two versions of the same man, could not understand how he could smile at Constance over breakfast and then spend the dark hours standing beneath another woman's window, could not fathom what purpose this vigil served or what he hoped to achieve through this strange penance. As October gave way to November and November began its slow march toward December, the pattern remained unbroken: Edmund at social functions with Constance, Edmund in the gardens with his silent vigil, Rosalind maintaining her stubborn refusal to acknowledge him, while society watched and whispered and waited for something, anything, to break. Late autumn arrived with the kind of cold that crept beneath even the heaviest shawls, transforming the once verdant gardens into a landscape of bare branches and frost-touched earth, and on a particularly brutal November night, when rain fell in sheets so thick it obscured everything beyond a few feet, Rosalind stood at her window watching the storm with a mixture of satisfaction and unease, certain that tonight at least Edmund would abandon his vigil, that even his inexplicable determination could not withstand such weather. Yet as midnight approached, she saw the familiar figure materialize through the rain like a ghost, taking his customary position beneath the oak tree, as though the storm were nothing more than a mild inconvenience, and something shifted in her chest, not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps never, but a crack in the armor of her resolve, a hairline fracture in the wall of indifference she had so carefully constructed. She watched him stand there as rain soaked through his greatcoat, watched the way he never sought shelter beneath the broader branches, never turned his collar up against the wind, simply stood with his face tilted toward her lighted window as water streamed down his features, and the stillness of him in the midst of such chaos struck her as either profound devotion or profound madness, possibly both, and she found herself moving closer to the window, her hand reaching for the latch before she caught herself and pulled back, furious at her own weakness, at the traitorous part of her heart that wanted to call down to him, to demand he come inside before he caught his death, to understand what drove a man to stand in a storm for a woman he had abandoned. For 2 hours she watched him endure the deluge, her emotions cycling through rage and confusion, and something dangerously close to concern, and when finally she could bear it no longer, she did something she had not done since the night she recognized him. She stopped closing her curtains completely, leaving them open perhaps 6 inches, a gap so small it might have been accidental, except that she had never been careless with such details before, and though she told herself it meant nothing, was merely practical, so she need not stand so close to the glass to observe whether he had finally shown sense and departed. She knew, even as she made the excuse that it was a lie, that this small opening in her curtains was an acknowledgement, however minute, a signal, however subtle, a crack in the facade of her indifference. Edmund noticed immediately. She saw the way his posture changed ever so slightly, saw something shift in the set of his shoulders, though he made no other movement, offered no gesture of triumph or relief, simply stood in the rain, with his gaze fixed on that narrow opening, as though it were a door thrown wide in welcome. And the rest of the night passed in this new configuration, Rosalind behind her partially opened curtains, and Edmund in the storm below, neither speaking, neither approaching, yet both aware that something had fundamentally altered in the silent war between them. When dawn finally came and Edmund departed as he always did, Rosalind remained at her window long after he had vanished into the grey morning, her mind churning with questions she was not ready to ask aloud. Chief among them, why she cared whether he stood in the rain, why his suffering should matter to her at all when he had caused her such profound pain, why the sight of his devotion, if devotion it was, should create this terrible ache in her chest that felt remarkably like the beginning of forgiveness, and she hated herself for the weakness even as she knew that tonight, and every night thereafter, her curtains would remain open that small, telling distance, a concession she could not quite bring herself to retract. The necessity of acquiring new reading material finally drove Rosalind from the sanctuary of Ashworth Manor in mid-December, for she had exhausted the library's offerings and her mother's well-intentioned suggestions that she might attend small gatherings or receive more visitors had only strengthened her resolve to find solace in literature rather than society. And so on a grey afternoon, when the threat of snow hung heavy in the air, she ventured into the village with only her maid Martha for company, making her way to Hartwell's Books, the modest shop that had supplied her family's reading habits for 2 generations, and she had just entered the warm interior with its familiar scent of leather and paper, and was running her gloved fingers along the spines of newly arrived volumes, when she sensed rather than saw another presence in the narrow aisle, and turning found herself face to face with Edmund Blackwood at a distance of perhaps 3 feet, close enough to see that the months had carved themselves into his features with cruel precision, for the man before her bore little resemblance to the composed Duke who had left her at the altar. His face was gaunt, shadows pooled beneath eyes that seemed to have forgotten sleep, and there was a quality of barely suppressed anguish in his expression that made her breath catch, even as fury rose hot in her throat. They stood frozen in that narrow space between shelves, the air between them dense with all the words that had never been spoken, and Rosalind's first instinct was to turn and flee, but pride locked her limbs in place, would not allow her to grant him even that small victory of driving her from a public space, and so she lifted her chin and met his gaze with all the ice she could summon, waiting for him to speak or move or do something to break this terrible suspended moment. And when he finally did speak, his voice was rough, unpracticed, as though words had become foreign to him in the long, silent hours of his vigil. "Lady Rosalind," he said, and the formal address felt like another small wound, a reminder of the intimacy they might have shared, the Christian names they might have used had he not chosen differently, and she inclined her head in the barest acknowledgement, her own voice when it came sounding brittle and strange to her own ears. "Your Grace." The title sat between them like a wall, a reminder of all the distance rank and choice had created, and she saw something flinch in his expression, saw his hand move as though to reach for her before falling back to his side, and the silence stretched again until he said with quiet intensity, "I deserve your hatred, but not your indifference." And the words struck her with unexpected force because they named precisely the thing she had been trying so hard to maintain, the careful neutrality that was her only defense against the chaos of her actual feelings, and she wanted to rage at him, to demand what right he had to object to her indifference, when indifference was surely the least of what he deserved. But instead, she simply gathered her skirts and moved past him in the narrow aisle, their shoulders nearly brushing in the confined space, and she walked to the counter with measured steps that concealed the trembling in her legs, purchased the first 3 books the proprietor recommended without truly hearing his descriptions, and departed into the cold afternoon without looking back, though she could feel Edmund's gaze following her like a physical weight, and even as she climbed into her carriage and directed the driver home, his words echoed in her mind with maddening persistence. "I deserve your hatred, but not your indifference," as though he had some claim on her emotions, as though even her contempt was something he had a right to demand, and she pressed her gloved hands against her eyes and wondered furiously why his haggard appearance should affect her at all, why the evidence of his suffering should create this unwanted ache in her chest when she should be rejoicing in his pain. and the realization that she was not rejoicing, that she was in fact profoundly disturbed by the glimpse of his anguish, terrified her more than all the months of his silent vigil combined. The letters began appearing 3 nights after their encounter in the bookshop, small folded squares of cream-colored paper, weighted down with smooth river stones on the iron bench beneath the oak tree, and Rosalind discovered the first one when she descended to the garden on a restless morning. Drawn by some impulse she refused to examine too closely, and she stared at the letter for a long moment before leaving it untouched and returning to the house with her heart beating an irregular rhythm against her ribs, telling herself she had no interest in whatever excuses or justifications Edmund might offer, that his words, whether written or spoken, meant nothing after what he had done. Yet that evening she found her gaze drawn repeatedly to her window, to the bench below where the white paper gleamed faintly in the moonlight, and when she finally retrieved it 4 days later, during another early morning walk, she told herself it was merely to clear the garden of debris, nothing more, though her hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet. The letter contained no salutation, no signature, only a few lines written in Edmund's precise hand. "I cannot ask forgiveness. I can only bear witness to your existence. That you breathe, that you wake, that you move through the world, this is enough. This has to be enough." She read the words 3 times, searching for hidden meaning or manipulation, finding only a strange, stark honesty that unsettled her more than any plea or excuse might have done. And she burned the letter in her fireplace that same morning, watching the paper curl and blacken, yet the words had already inscribed themselves in her memory with uncomfortable permanence. And when another letter appeared, 2 nights later, she retrieved it more quickly, and then another 3 days after that, each one similarly brief, similarly devoid of explanation or petition, one saying only, "Your light in the window is my North Star." Another, "I deserve the winter of your silence." And still another, "To know you are well is the only grace I can claim." And the more letters she read, the more confused she became, because this was not in what she had expected. Not apology or excuse-making or attempts to win her sympathy, but rather a kind of witness, as though Edmund were simply documenting his own unworthiness while affirming her existence, as though the act of standing beneath her window and leaving these strange fragmentary messages was less about seeking her forgiveness and more about some private penance she could not fully comprehend. By the end of December she had collected 7 letters, each one carefully burned after reading, yet each one adding to the growing complexity of her feelings, for these messages revealed nothing of why Edmund had abandoned her or what drove him to this nightly vigil, offered no excuses that might soften her anger or explanations that might restore her trust, yet in their very restraint, in their refusal to ask anything of her, they accomplished what pleas might never have achieved. They made her curious, made her wonder what kind of suffering would drive a man to such strange and patient devotion, made her question whether the Edmund who left these careful acknowledgments of his own unworthiness was the same man who had chosen wealth and convenience over their arranged marriage, and she hated that her certainty was eroding, hated that these brief cryptic messages were creating cracks in the wall of her righteous fury, hated most of all that she had begun waiting for the letters, checking the bench each morning with something uncomfortably close to anticipation, and the realization that Edmund had found a way past her defenses, not through grand gestures or passionate declarations, but through this quiet, persistent witness to her existence, filled her with equal parts rage and reluctant fascination, emotions she was increasingly unable to separate or control. December descended upon the countryside with a cruelty that seemed almost personal, bringing winds sharp enough to cut through wool and stone alike, and temperatures that turned morning frost into crystalline armor, coating every surface. Yet Edmund's vigil continued without pause or shelter, and Rosalind found herself watching not with satisfaction, but with growing alarm. As night after night he materialized beneath the oak tree, despite conditions that drove even hardy laborers indoors, standing in his dark greatcoat with snow gathering on his shoulders like some penitent saint from a medieval painting. And she told herself her concern was merely human decency, that she would worry for any creature exposed to such elements. Yet the tightness in her chest when she saw him shivering in the moonlight felt far more specific than general compassion, and the society pages that arrived with her mother's morning tea only deepened her confusion, for they painted vivid pictures of the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood presiding over elaborate winter entertainments at their London residence, Constance radiant in sapphire silk, Edmund the perfect attentive husband, their household apparently the very model of aristocratic harmony. And Rosalind would read these accounts in the morning and then watch Edmund standing alone in the freezing dark each night and wonder how one man could occupy two such different realities, and how he could smile and dance and play the devoted spouse by day, yet spend his nights in this strange, lonely penance. And the disconnect between his public performance and private suffering created questions she could not answer, complications she did not want to acknowledge. The night of the winter solstice brought temperatures so severe that even the house's great fireplaces could not entirely banish the cold from the rooms, and Rosalind woke past midnight to see Edmund already in position beneath the oak, his breath visible in great clouds of white vapor, his stillness absolute, despite the way his shoulders hunched against the bitter wind, and something in her broke watching him there, some final barrier between anger and compassion, crumbling like ice struck with a hammer, and before she could reconsider, she was pulling on her heaviest dressing gown and making her way downstairs, not to confront him but to gather the thick woolen blanket from the library, the one her father had favored during his final winter, and she slipped out through the morning-room door and crossed the frost-hard ground to the bench where Edmund always stood, her heart hammering with the audacity of this small kindness, and she draped the blanket across the bench's wooden surface and retreated quickly to the house without looking toward the oak tree, without acknowledging his presence in any direct way, maintaining the fiction that she simply happened to be airing bedding in the middle of a frozen night. When she reached her window and finally allowed herself to look down, she saw Edmund standing motionless as always, but his gaze was fixed on the bench, on the dark wool of the blanket, and even from this distance she could see something shift in his posture, some infinitesimal relaxation of the rigid control he maintained, and after a long moment he moved to the bench and gathered the blanket around his shoulders, and the sight of him wrapped in her father's old covering created such a complex tangle of emotions in Rosalind's chest that she had to press her hand against the window pane to steady herself, and she understood with sudden clarity that this was a conversation, that the blanket was a word spoken into the silence between them, neither forgiveness nor absolution, but a recognition that his suffering was real and witnessed. And when he looked up toward her window, she did not hide, but let him see her there, let him know that this small mercy was deliberate and conscious, and the way his hand rose to his heart in wordless acknowledgement made her turn away, trembling, wondering what she had begun, what door she had opened with this one simple gesture of human kindness toward the man who had destroyed her future. And as she climbed back into bed, she could still see him in her mind's eye, wrapped in wool that smelled of pipe smoke and old books and her father's gentle presence, standing vigil in the killing cold. And she did not know whether she was offering comfort or cruelty, mercy or prolonged torture, knew only that she could no longer maintain the fiction of indifference, that Edmund Blackwood's pain had become somehow entangled with her own, and the recognition terrified her more than all the months of his silent watching combined. The truth came to Rosalind not as a single revelation, but as fragments gathered over weeks, like pieces of broken glass that slowly assembled themselves into a coherent if painful picture, beginning with an overheard conversation between her mother and the vicar's wife in the morning room, where Rosalind had paused unseen in the hallway, catching only snippets about the old Duke's catastrophic losses at cards and debts that would have seen the entire family ruined, before she moved on with her heart beating strangely fast. And then came the casual mention from her former friend Eleanor, during an uncomfortable afternoon call, that, of course, everyone knew Lord Fairfax was desperate for a ducal connection after that business with his banking interests, willing to pay handsomely for the prestige, delivered with studied carelessness that suggested Eleanor knew exactly how each word would land, and gradually, through careful questions posed to servants who still held loyalty to her, through society pages read with new attention to what they did not say rather than what they proclaimed, through the concerned observations of her mother, who had her own network of information, Rosalind pieced together the shape of Edmund's impossible situation, learning that his father, the old Duke, had gambled away not merely a fortune but the very foundation of the Blackwood estate, and that creditors had been circling like carrion birds, ready to strip the family of everything, including the ancestral lands that had been held for 6 generations. that Edmund's 3 younger sisters would have been left without dowries or prospects or even the basic dignity of a home, and that Lord Fairfax, with his nouveau riche desperation for aristocratic connections, had offered a devil's bargain, a complete forgiveness of all debts, and a substantial settlement besides, in exchange for Edmund's marriage to Constance, an arrangement proposed and accepted mere days before Edmund's scheduled wedding to Rosalind, leaving him facing a choice between honouring his commitment to a woman he had chosen freely and saving his entire family from ruin and disgrace. The knowledge settled over Rosalind like ash after a fire, covering everything in grey ambiguity, where before there had been the clean, bright lines of righteous anger, and she found herself lying awake at night, imagining Edmund receiving that offer, seeing in her mind's eye the moment he must have understood what was being asked of him, the calculation he must have made, weighing his own happiness and honour against his family's survival. And though her fury at his choice remained, it was joined now by something else, something uncomfortably close to unwilling understanding, for what would she have done in his place? Would she have chosen differently if her own mother and sisters faced destitution, if their futures depended upon her sacrifice? And the questions tormented her because they had no easy answers, because Edmund's betrayal was no less devastating for having comprehensible motivations, yet she could no longer maintain the simple narrative of his selfishness and cruelty, could no longer tell herself he had merely chosen wealth over love, when the reality was so much more complex and terrible, a choice between 2 kinds of honour, with no path that did not require betrayal of someone, and understanding this did not heal her wounds, but it changed them, transformed her anger from something pure and sustaining into something more complicated and painful, a grief not just for what she had lost but for what Edmund had lost as well. For the man who stood each night beneath her window was not the villain she had needed him to be, but rather someone who had made an impossible choice and was living with the consequences, bearing witness to his own unworthiness with a persistence that suggested he knew no penance could be sufficient, yet could not stop himself from offering it anyway. And Rosalind wept when this understanding finally crystallized fully, wept not with the hot tears of outrage, but with the slower, colder tears of recognition that the world was crueler and more complicated than she had believed, that sometimes there were no good choices, only terrible ones, and that Edmund Blackwood was perhaps as much a victim of circumstances as she was, trapped in a marriage of convenience while his heart kept its nightly vigil beneath an oak tree, and she did not know if this knowledge made forgiveness possible or merely made her own. Continued anger feel petty and small, knew only that she could no longer see him simply as the man who had abandoned her, but must reckon with him as someone who had abandoned himself as well, and the shift in her perception felt like standing on ground she had believed solid, only to discover it had been slowly eroding beneath her feet all along. The storm arrived on a January night with the fury of something biblical, wind screaming around the manor's stone walls like a living thing in torment, sleet striking the windows with such force that Rosalind feared the glass might shatter, and she stood at her usual post, watching the garden dissolve into chaos, telling herself Edmund would surely seek shelter tonight, that even his stubborn penance had limits. Yet as the hour of his vigil approached, she saw the familiar figure emerge from the darkness and take his position beneath the oak tree, and something inside her broke completely, watching him stand there as sleet turned his greatcoat to a sheet of ice and wind threatened to knock him from his feet, and she was moving before conscious thought could intervene, pulling her cloak over her nightdress and descending the stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs, driven by something larger than anger or pride or the careful distance she had maintained for 6 months. And when she burst through the garden door into the teeth of the storm, Edmund turned toward her with an expression of such naked shock that she nearly fled back to safety. But instead she crossed the ice-slick ground to where he stood shivering violently, his face raw and red from wind, his eyes reflecting lightning, and she had to shout to be heard over the gale. "You are a fool, Your Grace, to stand here in this. What purpose does it serve to make yourself ill or worse?" And Edmund looked at her as though she were an apparition, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke, words torn away by wind so she had to move closer to hear. "The same purpose it has served every night, Lady Rosalind, to bear witness, to remember what I destroyed." And something in his phrasing, the word destroyed rather than lost, unlocked the words she had been holding back for months, and she found herself shouting into the storm. You chose duty over love. I understand that now. I understand the debts and the impossible situation. But what I cannot forgive, what I will never forgive, is that you did not tell me yourself. You did not give me the dignity of explanation or the choice to understand. You let me stand at that altar like a fool while society whispered and pitied, and that cowardice, Lord Blackwood, that failure of courage, that is what stands between us. Not your marriage to Constance, but the manner of your abandonment. And she was weeping now, tears hot against her frozen cheeks, and Edmund stood before her with sleet gathering on his shoulders like judgment, and said with terrible quiet that somehow carried over the wind's shriek, "You are absolutely right. The choice between Constance and you was forced upon me by circumstances beyond my control, but how I handled it, how I fled like a coward and sent a letter instead of facing you with truth, that was my choice alone, and it was the choice of a weak man who could not bear to see your pain, who could not endure being the cause of your tears, and so I made you endure something far worse, public humiliation and abandonment, and that is why I stand here, not seeking forgiveness, because I know there can be none, but ensuring I never forget what I am capable of in my weakness, never forget the cost of cowardice." And his voice broke on the final word, and Rosalind saw through the storm and darkness that he was weeping too, that his face was wet with more than sleet, and she reached out without thinking and took his frozen hand in hers, this first touch in half a year, burning despite the cold, and she said more gently, "You should have trusted me with the truth, Edmund. I would have understood. I would have released you if you had only asked." And he closed his eyes as though her words caused physical pain and whispered, "I know, and that knowledge is another punishment I deserve to carry." And they stood there in the howling dark, with their hands joined, and 6 months of silence finally broken, and though Rosalind offered no absolution, and Edmund asked for none, something had shifted between them, some acknowledgement given and received that would change everything that followed. The conversations began tentatively in the nights that followed the storm. Not every evening, but on some when Rosalind found herself descending to the garden where Edmund maintained his vigil, and they were careful conversations, conducted with the wariness of two people navigating terrain that might collapse beneath them at any moment. Rosalind always maintaining the boundary of physical distance and standing several feet away with her cloak wrapped tight against the lingering winter cold, and Edmund respecting that distance, absolutely, never moving closer unless she chose to close the gap herself, and gradually through these fragmented exchanges conducted under starlight and the bare branches of the oak tree, the full picture of Edmund's impossible situation emerged in all its terrible complexity, how his father's gambling had not been the casual losses of a gentleman at cards, but rather a systematic destruction of the family's financial foundation over years of increasingly desperate wagers and debts accumulating like snowfall until they had buried the estate entirely, how the creditors had given Edmund 1 month to produce payment or lose everything, including Blackwood Hall itself, which had been in his family since the time of the first Elizabeth, and how his 3 sisters, the youngest only 14, would have been left without even the basic provisions for their futures, condemned to lives of genteel poverty or worse. And Edmund's voice, when he spoke of this, carried a weight of responsibility that Rosalind recognized as both noble and crushing, the burden of being the only son, the heir upon whose shoulders rested not just his own fate, but that of everyone who depended upon the family name. He told her about Lord Fairfax's offer, how it had come mere 5 days before the wedding, presented not as a choice but as a salvation with conditions, complete erasure of all debts, and a settlement of £30,000 in exchange for Edmund's marriage to Constance, and how Edmund had spent those 5 days in a kind of waking nightmare trying to find another solution, writing to every connection his family possessed, seeking loans or extensions or any alternative path, only to be refused at every turn, because word of the old Duke's debts had spread, and no one wished to throw good money after bad, and finally on the 4th night he had made his choice, or rather accepted that no real choice existed, that duty to family must supersede personal happiness. He must take precedence over the quiet hope he had been nurturing that his marriage to Rosalind might become something real and warm and chosen. Constance understood from the beginning, Edmund said one night, when frost glittered on the ground between them like scattered diamonds. Her father arranged it as he arranged everything in her life, and she accepted it with the resignation of someone who had never expected to marry for love. But you, Rosalind, you were different. You were the one thing I had chosen for myself, the one decision I had made from the heart rather than duty. And destroying that, destroying us, was the price of preserving everything else, and I paid it because I am my father's son, and his mistakes became my responsibility. But I will not pretend the cost was anything less than everything that mattered. Rosalind listened to these revelations standing very still, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, and she understood that Edmund was not asking for forgiveness with these words, but rather offering her the truth he should have given her months ago. The explanation that might have spared her the worst of the humiliation, even if it could not have changed the outcome, and she found herself asking questions, not with anger now, but with a genuine desire to understand the shape of the trap he had been caught in. And through this understanding something shifted in her heart. Not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness felt too large and absolute for what she could offer, but rather a recognition that Edmund's vigil was indeed what he had named it, both penance for his cowardice in the manner of abandonment and a kind of prayer, a nightly assertion that though circumstances had forced him into one life, his heart remained constant to another, and that constancy, that stubborn refusal to accept the erasure of what they might have been, was perhaps the only honor he had left to offer her, and she accepted it not with words but with her continued presence in the garden, these conversations that acknowledged the reality of their loss, while also creating something new and fragile in the space between them. Spring arrived with a kind of cruel beauty that made every living thing seem to mock Rosalind's internal confusion. Crocuses pushing through the last of the snow in defiant purple clusters, and the air carrying warmth that felt like a promise after the long winter of her discontent, and she found herself looking forward to the evenings in the garden with an anticipation that frightened her, because it meant Edmund Blackwood had become not just a presence she tolerated, but one she needed. These careful conversations had carved out a space in her life that felt essential rather than intrusive, and she was beginning to understand with dawning horror that somewhere in the accumulated nights of honesty and witnessed pain, she had done the unthinkable and fallen in love with him, not the Edmund who had abandoned her at the altar, but this haunted man who stood vigil in all weather and spoke of his failures with unflinching clarity. And she was considering what this meant, what possibilities might exist if circumstances were different, when Edmund arrived one April evening with an expression that made her heart clench with premature grief. "I must speak with you about a matter of some importance," he said without preamble, his voice carrying a formality that had been absent from their recent exchanges, and Rosalind felt the ground shift beneath her feet as she waited for whatever blow was coming. "Constance is with child," Edmund continued, the words falling like stones into still water. "The announcement will be made public within the week, and I wanted you to hear it from me directly, rather than through society gossip or the papers." Rosalind stood very still, processing this information and all its implications. The absolute nature of Edmund's duty now that a child was involved, an innocent life that would bind him irrevocably to Constance and to the choice he had made 8 months ago, and she realized with shock that she had been harboring some small, unacknowledged hope that circumstances might somehow change, that the impossible might become possible, but a child ended all such speculation with the finality of a door closing on a room she would never enter. "I see," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Then I offer my congratulations to you and the Duchess." Edmund flinched at the title, at the formality she had deliberately employed, and continued with visible effort. "This means I must cease these visits, Rosalind. It is no longer appropriate for a married man to maintain such a vigil, especially one who will soon be a father. My duty must be absolute now, to Constance and to the child who had no choice in the circumstances of their creation, and I cannot in good conscience continue to divide my attention and my heart when there is an innocent life that will depend upon my presence and my care." He was right, of course. Rosalind knew he was right even as something inside her screamed against the logic of it, and she found herself saying with a calmness that felt like ice forming over deep water, "You are correct, Your Grace. A child changes everything. You must attend to your responsibilities without distraction." And even as she spoke, the words she was realizing with terrible clarity, that she would miss this, miss him, miss these strange broken conversations that had somehow become the center around which her life revolved. And more terrifying still was the recognition that she had forgiven him, that somewhere in the accumulation of honest words and witnessed suffering, she had let go of the anger that had sustained her through the worst of her humiliation. And now, when forgiveness had finally arrived, it was too late, because he was leaving. And this time, it was right that he should go. And she stood there in the spring garden, with new flowers blooming all around them, and felt the second loss of Edmund Blackwood, this one more painful than the first, because now she knew exactly what she was losing, and understood that she loved him, despite everything, perhaps because of everything, and that knowledge would have to be enough to sustain her through whatever came next. The gardens beneath Rosalind's window remained empty night after night, and she found herself standing at the glass long past the hour when Edmund would have arrived, watching the space where he had stood for so many months, as though her vigil might somehow summon him back into existence. But the oak tree cast its shadows on barren ground, and the bench where she had once left a blanket sat unused, and the absence was so complete it felt like a physical wound, something she could press her hand against and feel the edges of sharp and distinct. The first week of his absence, she told herself, it was relief, she felt, that the ending of their strange nocturnal meetings was exactly what propriety demanded and what her peace of mind required, but by the second week she could no longer maintain the fiction and had to acknowledge that she missed him with an intensity that frightened her, missed the sound of his voice in the darkness and the careful way he maintained the distance she required, and even the pain of their conversations, because that pain had been shared and witnessed, and therefore somehow more bearable than this solitary ache. She went through her days in a kind of fog, attending to her correspondence and her household duties, and the small routines that had sustained her through the first abandonment. But everything felt hollow now, drained of color and meaning, and she realized with terrible clarity that Edmund's presence had become not just something she tolerated, but something essential to her ability to navigate the world, that she had been depending on those hours in the garden to feel fully alive, and fully herself in a way that nothing else allowed. Her internal reckoning with her own feelings was brutal and unsparing, forcing her to examine the truth she had been avoiding for weeks, that she had fallen in love with Edmund Blackwood, not despite their broken history, but perhaps because of it, because the man who stood vigil beneath her window in all weather was someone she understood in ways she never could have if their first wedding had proceeded as planned, someone whose failures and regrets and stubborn hope mirrored her own, and their conversations had built something more solid than romance, something rooted in honesty and mutual recognition of pain, and that foundation had become precious to her without her quite realizing when it happened. The irony was so cruel it would have been laughable if it weren't destroying her. She had forgiven him and fallen in love with him precisely at the moment when he became truly and permanently lost to her, when his duty to Constance and their unborn child made any future between them not just unlikely but morally impossible, and Rosalind found herself grieving not just the loss of Edmund's presence but the loss of possibilities she had only just begun to recognize existed, the future they might have built if circumstances had been different, if timing had been kinder, if the world had not demanded so much from both of them. This grief was different from the humiliation of the abandoned wedding, deeper and more personal, because now she knew exactly what she was losing and could measure it against the accumulated weight of honest words and shared silences, and she understood with devastating clarity that loving someone and losing them twice was a particular kind of torment, each loss compounding the other until she could hardly remember who she had been before Edmund Blackwood had entered her life, and then left it, and then returned only to leave again, and she stood at her window night after night, watching empty gardens and learning to live with an absence that felt like amputation, necessary perhaps, but no less crippling for its necessity. The knock came near midnight 3 weeks after Edmund's final visit, urgent enough to wake Rosalind from the half-sleep that was all she managed these days, and when her maid appeared at the chamber door with wide, frightened eyes, saying there was a lady downstairs who insisted on seeing her immediately, Rosalind's first thought was that something had happened to Edmund, some accident or illness, and she descended the stairs in her dressing gown, with her heart hammering against her ribs, only to find Constance Blackwood in her drawing-room, heavily pregnant and wrapped in a dark cloak, her face pale but determined in the candlelight. "Lady Rosalind," Constance said without preamble, "forgive the intrusion at such an hour, but what I have to tell you cannot wait for morning proprieties, and I suspect you would not receive me if I called at a decent hour in any case." And Rosalind stood frozen in the doorway, trying to reconcile this midnight visitation with everything she thought she understood about the situation, about Edmund's duty and Constance's claim, and the insurmountable nature of their obstacles. "I have come to tell you the truth that my husband will not tell you himself, because he believes he has no right to hope," Constance continued, settling herself carefully into a chair and gesturing for Rosalind to sit as though this were her own drawing room rather than an invaded sanctuary. "The truth is that my marriage to Edmund was always meant to be temporary, a business arrangement that served my father's political purposes and saved Edmund's family from ruin, but it was never intended to be permanent, despite all appearances to the contrary." Rosalind felt the room tilt slightly as she tried to process these words, the implications crashing over her in waves, and Constance went on with the calm determination of someone who had rehearsed this speech many times. "You see, I have loved another for years, a vicar named Thomas Gray, who has no fortune and no prospects beyond his modest living, and my father would never have countenanced such a match, but he needed the alliance with the Blackwood name for reasons of parliamentary influence, and so an arrangement was made. I would marry Edmund, provide the appearance of a proper ducal union for as long as necessary, and then when my father's political maneuvering was complete, the marriage would be quietly dissolved, and I would be free to marry where my heart lay, with a generous settlement to ensure Thomas and I could live comfortably despite his lack of wealth." The pregnancy, Constance explained with startling frankness, had complicated matters somewhat, but not irrevocably. The child was indeed Edmund's, because the arrangement had required at least the appearance of a true marriage, and both she and Edmund had understood that an heir might seal the alliance more convincingly, but provisions had been made. The child would be acknowledged and provided for, but raised primarily by Constance and Thomas, once the dissolution was complete, and Edmund had agreed to all of this because it was the only way to save his family, while eventually being free to choose his own path. "He loves you, Lady Rosalind," Constance said with gentle certainty. "He has always loved you. Even when he was standing beside me at the altar, he loved you. And every night he spent beneath your window was not mere penance but prayer, that somehow you might understand, might forgive, might wait, though he had no right to ask for any of those things." And she reached into her cloak to produce a letter bearing Edmund's seal. "He does not know I have come here tonight. He would be furious if he knew, because he believes he has forfeited any claim to your regard, and that you deserve better than a man who abandoned you, once regardless of his reasons. But I could not let you go on believing that he is lost to you, when the truth is that he is bound only by his own conviction that he is unworthy of a second chance." Rosalind took the letter with trembling hands, her mind reeling with the enormity of what Constance had revealed, and when she finally found her voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why are you telling me this?" And Constance smiled with something that looked like understanding and perhaps a touch of envy, saying, "Because I know what it is to love someone society deems impossible, and because Edmund Blackwood is a better man than he believes himself to be, and deserves the happiness he will never claim for himself, and because you, Lady Rosalind, deserve to make your choice with full knowledge rather than in ignorance, as you were forced to before." And then she was rising with some difficulty, preparing to leave as abruptly as she had arrived, and Rosalind stood there in her drawing room at midnight, holding a letter that might change everything, and feeling the future shift beneath her feet like sand after a wave. Uncertain and terrifying, and full of possibilities she had thought forever closed to her. Rosalind sat awake through what remained of the night after Constance's departure, the sealed letter lying unopened on her writing desk, while she wrestled with the question that Constance's revelation had thrust upon her. Could she trust again? Could she believe in promises after they had been so spectacularly broken before? Could she risk her heart a second time, knowing exactly how it felt to have it shattered? And the dawn found her no closer to certainty, but possessed of a strange clarity that whatever answer she arrived at must come from confronting Edmund directly, rather than reading words he had written without knowledge of Constance's intervention. She dressed carefully in the grey morning light, choosing a simple day dress rather than anything that might suggest she was making an effort to impress, and instructed her driver to take her to Blackwood Hall without allowing herself time to reconsider the decision, and the journey passed in a blur of countryside, still wet with spring rain, while her mind rehearsed and discarded 100 different speeches, until she realized that there was really only one question that mattered, one test that would tell her everything she needed to know about whether a future between them was possible or merely another beautiful impossibility. The butler who answered the door at Blackwood Hall looked startled to see her, but admitted her without question, perhaps sensing something in her bearing that made objection impossible, and he led her through halls she had never seen before to Edmund's private study, where he knocked once and entered to announce her presence, and Rosalind followed before she could lose her nerve to find Edmund rising from behind a massive oak desk covered in papers and ledgers, and the sight of him stopped her breath because Constance had been right about his appearance. He looked broken in ways that had nothing to do with physical injury, his face drawn and pale and marked with the kind of exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights and abandoned hope. "Rosalind," he said, and just her name in his voice contained such a mixture of longing and despair that she almost turned and fled, but she had not come this far to retreat now, and so she remained in the doorway while the butler withdrew and closed the door behind him, leaving them alone together for the first time since that night in the garden when he had told her he would not return. "I have one question to ask you," she said, keeping her voice steady through force of will, "and I require an honest answer regardless of what you think I wish to hear or what propriety might demand." And Edmund nodded slowly, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as though he needed its solidity to remain upright, and she drew a breath and asked the question that would determine everything. "If you were free, if all obstacles were removed and you could choose without consequence or duty to constrain you, would you still want me after everything that has passed between us? After the hurt and the anger and the months of silence, after you have seen me at my worst and I have seen your failures laid bare, would you still choose me?" The silence that followed her question seemed to stretch for an eternity, while Edmund stared at her with an expression she could not read, and then he moved around the desk with careful, deliberate steps until he stood before her close enough that she could see the shadows beneath his eyes and the tremor in his hands. And he said with quiet, devastating certainty, "Every night I stood beneath your window was my answer to that question. Every letter I left, knowing you might never read it. Every moment I remained, when any sensible man would have accepted your rejection and moved on, all of it was my answer, because wanting you has never been the question. Rosalind, wanting you is the one constant truth in a life that has required me to compromise every other principle I thought I possessed. And if I were free today, I would beg you to marry me, and if you refused, I would beg again tomorrow. And I would continue begging until you believed that my constancy is not performance or penance, but the simple recognition that you are the only future I can imagine that does not feel like slow death." And Rosalind felt tears sliding down her cheeks because she heard in his words the echo of her own desperate hope, the possibility that love built on ruins might be stronger than love that never faced testing, and she reached out to take his hand and said simply, "Then we begin again." They courted properly this time, not with the rushed arrangement that had characterized their first engagement, but with the careful deliberation of two people who had learned that love required more than attraction or duty, and Edmund called at Ashworth Manor 3 times each week at respectable hours with Rosalind's mother present as chaperone, and they walked in the gardens where he had once kept his vigil and spoke of everything they had never discussed before, their childhoods and their fears, their disappointments and their dreams, the small details that comprised the texture of their inner lives rather than the polished surfaces they presented to society. The scandal that erupted when Constance's marriage was quietly dissolved sent shockwaves through the ton, and when she married her vicar in a simple ceremony 3 months later with her infant daughter in attendance, society pages overflowed with speculation and condemnation, but Rosalind found she cared less for their opinions than she once had, because she had learned through hard experience that public perception bore little relationship to private truth, and she weathered the gossip with Edmund at her side, their relationship growing stronger through the shared experience of social censure rather than weakening beneath it. They spoke often of the past because Rosalind insisted that they could not build a future on unexamined wounds, and Edmund answered every question she posed about his choices and his marriage to Constance with painful honesty, and gradually she came to understand not just what he had done, but why. And more importantly, she came to believe that he understood the depth of hurt his actions had caused regardless of their necessity, and this acknowledgement proved more valuable than any amount of apology, because it meant he truly saw her pain, rather than merely regretting his own role in causing it. The months passed in a series of small revelations and accumulated trust, walks through spring gardens and summer meadows, conversations that stretched from afternoon tea until the early evening stars appeared, and Rosalind discovered that Edmund possessed a dry wit she had never suspected, and a tenderness in discussing his younger sisters that spoke to depths of feeling his public demeanor never revealed, while Edmund learned that Rosalind's quiet dignity masked not coldness as society believed, but rather a fierce protective instinct that guarded a deeply feeling heart, and they found they shared a love of poetry and a skepticism about fashionable society's values, and a desire for a life built on substance rather than appearance. When Edmund proposed in August, nearly a year after Rosalind had walked into his study and asked if he would still want her, he did so without the presumption of certainty that had characterized their first engagement, kneeling in her mother's drawing room, with his voice shaking slightly as he asked whether she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, and he made clear that she should take whatever time she needed to consider, that he would wait as long as necessary for her answer, that his constancy was not contingent on her immediate acceptance. And Rosalind found that this uncertainty, this genuine question rather than assumed arrangement, was itself a kind of proposal she could trust, because it acknowledged her agency and her right to choose or refuse without consequence to his regard. She said yes that same afternoon because she had spent months learning to trust again and had discovered that love built on honesty and mutual understanding felt entirely different from love built on hope and assumption. And when Edmund slipped his grandmother's ring onto her finger, not the ostentatious diamond he had offered before, but a simple band of gold set with small sapphires, she felt the rightness of the moment settle into her bones like recognition, like coming home after a long journey through foreign lands, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together with eyes open and hearts willing to weather storms, because they had already survived the worst and emerged not broken but tempered, not bitter but wise, not hardened but capable of deeper feeling for having known what it meant to lose and find each other again. The wedding took place on a cool October morning in the small chapel at Ashworth Manor, the same chapel where Rosalind had been baptized as an infant and where her father's funeral had been held, and the choice of venue was deliberate because she wanted this marriage to begin in a place that held her history, rather than in the grand cathedral, where society could perform its judgments, and the guest list numbered barely 20 souls, only immediate family and the few friends who had remained constant through scandal and separation, and Rosalind dressed in her mother's chambers, wearing not the elaborate ivory gown that had hung unworn in her wardrobe for months after the first failed wedding, but rather a simple dress of pale blue silk with minimal adornment, her hair arranged in a loose style that felt more like herself than the elaborate construction the previous ceremony had demanded, and her mother wept as she fastened the pearl necklace that had belonged to Rosalind's grandmother around her neck, tears of joy rather than the anxious concern that had marked that other morning so long ago. Edmund waited at the altar looking both terrified and grateful, wearing a dark coat without ostentatious decoration, and when Rosalind entered the chapel on her uncle's arm, she saw him draw a sharp breath, as though he still could not quite believe she had agreed to this second chance, and she met his eyes directly as she walked toward him, no longer the uncertain girl who had made this journey before, but a woman who had been broken and rebuilt and knew exactly what she was choosing and why. The vicar who performed the ceremony was the same man who had waited uselessly at the grand cathedral before, and if he felt any irony in the situation, he gave no sign, conducting the service with simple dignity, and when the moment came for vows, Edmund's voice shook as he spoke words he had written himself rather than the traditional formulation, saying, "I stand before you unworthy of this grace you offer, but determined to spend every day of my remaining life proving myself worthy of your trust, knowing I can never erase the pain I caused, but hoping to build something beautiful enough that the weight of joy will eventually balance the weight of sorrow. And I promise you honesty above all things, because pretty lies nearly destroyed us both, and only truth brought us back to each other." And Rosalind felt tears slide down her face, but they were clean tears unmarred by bitterness, and when her turn came, she said, "I choose you," knowing exactly what choosing means, not with blind hope, but with open eyes. Not because I have forgotten pain, but because I have learned that love built on truth and forgiveness is stronger than love, that never faced testing. And I promise to meet your honesty with my own, to weather storms at your side rather than in silence, and to build a life that honors both what we lost and what we found. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife and Edmund kissed her, it felt like arriving home after a journey that had required every ounce of courage. She possessed, and the small gathering erupted in applause and genuine celebration. And afterward, there was a simple breakfast in Ashworth Manor's dining room with laughter and toasts, and none of the forced gaiety that characterized grand society weddings, just honest joy at a union that had been earned rather than arranged. And as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, Rosalind caught Edmund's hand and led him to the garden where he had once kept his lonely vigil, and they stood together beneath her window, and he said quietly, "I never imagined when I stood here in darkness that it would lead to this." And she replied, "Neither did I, but perhaps that is the nature of grace, that it arrives in forms we cannot predict and asks us to believe in possibilities we thought were dead." And they remained there in the golden autumn light, two people who had learned that the straightest path is not always the one that leads to the truest destination, beginning their actual life together not with certainty, but with something better, with hard-won understanding, and the knowledge that they had already survived the worst, and chosen each other anyway. 5 years had passed since that October wedding in Ashworth Chapel, and Blackwood Hall had been transformed from the cold formal residence it had been under Edmund's father into something warmer and more alive, filled with children's laughter and the comfortable chaos of a household built on love rather than duty. And on this particular autumn afternoon, Rosalind stood at the drawing-room window, watching Edmund in the garden with their 3 children, their eldest daughter, Catherine, nearly 4 years old, running ahead, while Edmund carried their twin sons who had just celebrated their first birthday, and she felt the familiar warmth bloom in her chest at the sight of them together. At Edmund's patient attention as Catherine showed him something she had found among the roses, at the way he shifted the babies in his arms so he could properly examine whatever treasure she offered, and it struck her, as it often did, that this ordinary domestic happiness had seemed impossible during those dark months of separation and pain, that the man who now devoted himself to tea parties with stuffed animals and bedtime stories had once stood alone beneath her window night after night in silent penance, and she wondered if he ever thought of those nights, whether he remembered the cold and the rain and the desperate hope that had brought him there, or whether, like her, he sometimes had to remind himself that the early chapters of their story had been so painful because the present felt so complete it seemed to have always existed. Later that evening, after the children had been put to bed, Edmund found her in the library that had once been her refuge at Ashworth Manor, but which they had recreated here at Blackwood Hall, lined with the books they had collected together during their courtship and filled with comfortable chairs arranged for conversation rather than solitary reading, and he sat beside her and took her hand and said, "Catherine asked me today why we don't have a grand portrait of our wedding like other families, and I told her it was because the most important things cannot be captured in paint, in that our wedding was perfect, precisely because it was small and real, and chose substance over spectacle." And Rosalind smiled and replied, "She will understand someday when she is older that sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones that required the longest battles." And they sat in comfortable silence watching the fire burn low, two people who had learned that love was not the absence of pain, but the willingness to walk through pain towards something truer and more lasting. Dear listener, perhaps you find yourself in a season of waiting, standing as Edmund once stood beneath windows that remain curtained against you, or perhaps you are the one behind the curtains, nursing wounds and wondering whether trust can ever be rebuilt after it has been shattered. And I would tell you this: the straightest path is not always the one that leads home, and sometimes the love that nearly destroys us is the same love that ultimately saves us, if we have the courage to let it transform rather than define us. And there is a difference between perfect timing and right timing, between love that arrives easily and love that must be earned through patience and honesty, and the willingness to build on truth rather than illusion. The heart that has been broken and mended is stronger than the heart that has never known fracture, for it understands that love is not the absence of difficulty, but the commitment to work through difficulty together, not the fantasy of effortless harmony, but the reality of two imperfect souls choosing each other daily, despite and because of their imperfections. And if you are waiting for a sign that your story can still have a happy ending, let this tale be that sign. Let it remind you that grace often arrives in unexpected forms and that the longest nights sometimes precede the most beautiful dawns. May you find the courage to stand beneath windows when necessary and the wisdom to eventually open them. May you learn to build love on honesty rather than hope alone. And may you discover, as Rosalind and Edmund did, that some stories worth telling require the patience to let them unfold in their own time rather than in the time we demand. Until we meet again, may peace find you in unexpected gardens. May you rest well knowing that broken things can be mended into something more beautiful than they were before. And may you remember always that the heart's capacity for healing is matched only by its capacity for hope. This has been a story from Greatest Love Stories, where we believe that the best romances are not the ones that come easily, but the ones that teach us who we are capable of becoming.